Same way for years. The company is successful because of it. You're talking about change, but change isn't always the answer. We don't need to fix what isn't broken. His words cut through the air, cold and dismissive, but Zaid didn't flinch. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him, the eyes of the executives, the history of the company, all of it bearing down on his shoulders. The subtle racism he had faced over the years, the patronizing comments, the questions about his credentials, the doubts about his capabilities, rushed to the forefront of his mind. But Zaid knew that this moment, this meeting, wasn't just about proving his worth to these people. It was about shifting the balance of power. It was about more than just a company's bottom line. It was about transforming an entire system that had been designed to keep people like him out. The anger burned in his chest, but Zaid pushed it down. He couldn't let Benjamin's words get under his skin. Not today. Today, he wasn't the exception anymore. Today, he was the one in charge. "I'm not here to fix what's not broken, Benjamin," Zaid said, his voice unwavering, "but to ensure that we're prepared for what's coming. The world is changing, and we need to change with it. If we continue to ignore the social responsibility that comes with our position, if we continue to operate under the assumption that nothing needs to evolve, we'll be left behind. We're not just here to make money. We're here to make an impact." The room was still. Zaid could feel the energy shift as the words hung in the air, a palpable tension rising. He had never spoken so boldly before. The silence that followed felt suffocating, and for a moment, he feared he had overstepped. But when he looked up, he saw the executive's eyes, some of them skeptical, others uncertain. There was no going back now. Benjamin's smile faltered, his icy demeanor hardening. His lips tightened, and for the first time, Zaid saw a flash of vulnerability in his eyes. Beneath the layers of confidence and authority, Benjamin was rattled. He had never been questioned like this. Not by someone like Zaid. The other executives were shifting in their seats now, some exchanging glances, others looking down at their hands. Zaid had turned the room against Benjamin in an instant. The old guard was losing their grip on the future, and they knew it. Benjamin's laugh was hollow. "You're talking about ideals, Zaid. But this is business, not some social experiment. You think you can change the entire structure of this company with a few words and some fancy ideals? You think that's how things work around here?" Zaid's pulse quickened, but he stood his ground. "No, Benjamin," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm talking about the future. This company was built by tradition, yes, but traditions can be toxic. It's time to break free from what's been holding us back. It's time to evolve." For a long, tense moment, Benjamin just stared at him, his gaze icy, searching for any crack in Zaid's confidence. But Zaid refused to break. He had earned his place here, and he wasn't going to let Benjamin or anyone else take that away from him. The air in the room was thick with anticipation, the weight of years of power and privilege hanging on every word. Zaid felt his heart pounding, his palms clammy, but his voice never wavered. This was his time. This was his fight. The room wasn't just witnessing a changing of the guard. It was witnessing the birth of something new. Benjamin leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the polished surface of the table. His expression was unreadable, but Zaid could feel the challenge in the air, the unspoken question that hung between them. Would Zaid be able to follow through? Would he be able to lead this company into a new era? Zaid didn't have all the answers, but he knew this was just the beginning. And as the room fell silent once more, he realized that this moment wasn't just about business. It was about legacy. It was about proving that the world was ready for change, and that he, Zaid Carter, would be the one to lead it. Zaid felt his stomach tighten as Officer Harris's eyes lingered on him. The way the officer's gaze was sharp, almost accusatory, made Zaid's skin prickle with unease. He couldn't help but feel a wave of dread wash over him, the same kind of unease he had felt countless times before, when he was the only black man in the room, and others couldn't help but see him as out of place. His heart raced faster now, the sting of Benjamin's earlier dismissal still fresh, but now compounded by the intrusion of the officers. What was happening? Why were they here? The room seemed to hold its breath as Officer Harris turned his gaze from Zaid to Benjamin. The tension that had been building between Zaid and Benjamin only escalated now, amplified by the arrival of these figures of authority. Zaid's eyes locked onto Officer Harris's for a brief moment. He could see the subtle judgment in his eyes. He knew it was there, though it wasn't something the officer had spoken aloud, and it wasn't the first time he had felt it. Benjamin sat up straighter, his posture suddenly stiff, as though the authority of the officers had momentarily given him a boost of confidence. "No, no problem," he said, his voice now far too smooth, attempting to downplay the tension. "Just discussing the future of the company." Zaid could see the disingenuousness in Benjamin's attempt to brush it off, but the damage had been done. The officers were here now, and their presence was a glaring symbol of a deeper issue. A reminder that Zaid's every move, every word was scrutinized, not just by the people around the table, but by those who had never seen him as an equal. His heart pounded louder, but Zaid's expression didn't waver. He had been preparing for moments like this his entire life. The looks, the doubt, the subtle aggression. But that didn't mean it hurt any less. It didn't mean that his fight for respect and acknowledgement was any less exhausting. He had worked so hard, climbed so many mountains, only to be reminded that some people saw him as an outsider. For a moment, everything around Zaid seemed to slow down. The beat of his heart, the air in the room, even the conversation that was still faintly bubbling in the background. He could feel his pulse in his throat, the tension building up inside him like a pressure cooker. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold it all in, how much longer he could keep pushing forward when every step forward felt like 2 steps backward. He leaned back in his chair, feeling his hands tighten around the edges of the table, trying to steady himself. "Benjamin," Zaid said, his voice quiet but sharp, "this is about more than just projections and numbers. It's about vision. It's about direction. And if you can't see that, then you'll never understand what this company truly needs to grow." Benjamin's lips curled in a smile, but Zaid could see the strain behind it. He knew Benjamin was trying to maintain his grip on the room, but Zaid could sense that his words were beginning to rattle him. The room was shifting, just a little, but enough for Zaid to feel that maybe, just maybe, he had the upper hand. And then Officer Harris spoke again, his voice cutting through the growing tension like a knife. "We just need to make sure everything's in order," he said, his gaze flickering back to Zaid, his tone still unsettlingly calm. The way his eyes flicked to Benjamin and then back to Zaid made it clear. There was something about Zaid that the officer couldn't quite trust. It was the same feeling Zaid had encountered so many times before. The feeling that people saw him first and foremost for what he looked like, not who he was. And right now in this room, it felt like he was back at square one, fighting for a seat at the table that should have been his from the start. Benjamin, sensing the rising tension, waved a dismissive hand, forcing a chuckle. "There's nothing to see here, officers," he said, his voice light, as if the entire confrontation was nothing more than a nuisance. "We're just having a little discussion, nothing that needs your attention." But the officer's gaze remained fixed on Zaid, the unspoken judgment lingering in the air, thick and suffocating. Zaid could feel it, a cold pressure weighing down on him. His stomach twisted in knots. He had faced these moments before. The looks, the whispers, the way people couldn't believe someone like him could truly belong in spaces like this. But today, in this moment, it felt different. This wasn't just about him and Benjamin anymore. It was about an entire system that had built itself on the exclusion of people like him. And it was suffocating him. Zaid breathed in deeply, his chest tight with the weight of everything he was fighting for. He had come too far to back down now. "I'm not asking for your approval, Benjamin," Zaid said, his voice firm now, carrying a calm authority that matched the storm churning inside him. "I'm telling you what this company needs." Benjamin looked momentarily startled by their sudden entrance, but quickly composed himself. "No problem at all, gentlemen. We're just having a discussion." He flashed a forced smile at Zaid, as if trying to defuse the tension with a show of politeness, but it didn't reach his eyes. Zaid felt a prickling sense of unease crawling up his spine. "Actually, it seems like there's a misunderstanding," Officer Harris continued, stepping closer to the table, his gaze never leaving Zaid. "Mr. Carter, I'm afraid you're not authorized to be in this meeting room." His words, while technically polite, carried an undertone that was anything but. Zaid's heart dropped, and he could feel his throat tighten. The air was suddenly thick with disbelief. How could they be questioning him like this? He was the new CEO. He was the one in charge here. Yet here were the officers, imposing their authority over him, acting as though he didn't belong. Benjamin glanced at Officer Harris and then at the room's other executive members, as if waiting for someone to speak up, but no one did. It was as though the officers had just invaded Zaid's space, questioning his very right to exist in this role. "Excuse me." Zaid's voice broke through the tension. He stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, his fists clenched at his sides. "I'm the CEO of this company. I'm authorized to be here." The words felt foreign on his tongue, too heavy and unreal. It was difficult to believe that this was his reality, that the same people who had worked under his leadership just hours ago were now watching him be treated like an intruder. Officer Harris didn't flinch. "I understand your position, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice cold, "but I was informed otherwise. We need to ask you to leave." Zaid's mind raced. What was going on? Why were they doing this? It wasn't just about the company. This felt like something bigger, a calculated move to undermine him. He could feel the weight of the officers' eyes on him, the scrutiny, the judgment. The underlying message was clear: you don't belong here. He could see the way Benjamin and the other executives were watching him. Some were uncomfortable, others were just waiting for the situation to resolve itself. But none of them spoke up. Not one of them defended him. He turned to Benjamin, his voice low but filled with barely contained anger. "Is this how you plan to handle this? You bring in officers to question my right to be here?" Benjamin remained silent, his face impassive. Zaid could see the flicker of something in his eyes, something like satisfaction, as if this whole situation was playing out exactly as he had hoped. The officer's stance didn't change. Officer Harris looked Zaid up and down once more, as if appraising him, then nodded slightly to his partner, signaling that they should take action. Without another word, Harris stepped closer, and Zaid could feel the stifling pressure of their presence. His mind screamed for clarity, for answers, but the words wouldn't come. How had it come to this? He had earned his place, fought for it, yet here he was, standing in front of a room full of people who saw his skin color before they saw his accomplishments. With an effort, Zaid straightened his shoulders, forcing himself to meet Harris's eyes, trying not to let his fists tremble. "I'm not leaving," Zaid said, his voice shaking only slightly. "Mr. Carter," Officer Harris began again, his tone colder now, "you can either leave voluntarily or we can make this difficult for you. We don't want to escalate things, but we will if we have to." The words felt like a slap. Zaid's mind was spinning, the frustration building up until it was all he could focus on. He had no intention of backing down. No one had ever given him what he had earned. He had always fought for everything, and this moment was no different. But the exhaustion, mental and emotional, was starting to hit him, and the realization that he was being singled out so brazenly, so publicly, was sinking in. In the silence that followed, he could almost hear the unspoken thoughts of the room, the hesitation, the discomfort. The tension crackled, and Zaid's heart raced as he took a deep breath, steeling himself for what would come next. Zaid's heart hammered in his chest, the weight of the moment crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He was standing in the middle of the boardroom, facing not only the officers, but an entire room of people who had once trusted him, believed in him, and now seemed to be silent observers to his humiliation. He clenched his fists tighter, the pressure of their stares pressing on him. The suffocating silence made his skin prickle, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Why is no one speaking up? The thought rang out in his mind like an unanswered prayer. He had always been the one to fight for what was right, to speak out when injustice reared its ugly head. But now he was alone. With no one to turn to, no one to back him up. The realization of how alone he truly was cut deeper than the officer's presence ever could. Benjamin's gaze flickered from Zaid to the officers, a subtle but unmistakable look of triumph in his eyes. The moment was more than just about the company, more than just about power. It was about dominance. Zaid had walked in expecting to challenge the status quo, to reshape the company in his image. But now it felt as if the weight of systemic oppression had followed him into this room. A murmur spread across the table. Low whispers, the sound of tension building in the air. "Mr. Carter, you're making this difficult," Officer Harris said, his voice ice cold as he moved closer to Zaid, blocking his path. The officer's presence felt almost suffocating now, a calculated show of force. Zaid could feel the muscles in his neck tense as the officer's footsteps echoed in his mind, a countdown to the inevitable. "Difficult?" Zaid repeated, his voice rising, the anger in him beginning to boil over. "You have no idea what difficult is." His words echoed in the room, a burst of defiance that caught the attention of everyone present. For a brief moment, the room went silent. Even the officers paused, caught off guard by the intensity of Zaid's voice. The weight of the words seemed to hang in the air, lingering like a challenge, daring anyone to dismiss them. But no one did. Benjamin shifted in his seat, his expression cold. "You're not in control here, Zaid. I think it's time you realize that," he said, his words laced with venom. "You're not qualified to lead this company. You've only been given this position because of quotas, not because you deserve it." The words hit Zaid like a slap across the face. He could feel his jaw tighten, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He wanted to shout back, to demand that they see him for the man he was, for the work he had put in to get to this point. But the frustration, the exhaustion, and the anger all mixed together into something far more dangerous. The kind of rage that bubbles beneath the surface until it threatens to consume you. "I'm here because I earned it," Zaid growled, his voice low but filled with a fierce certainty. "I've worked harder than any of you to get to this point. I'm here because I belong here." Officer Harris didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, narrowing the distance between them, his gaze still fixed on Zaid like a predator eyeing its prey. "You're not the one in charge anymore," he said, his voice chillingly calm. "You're making this harder for yourself." Zaid took a deep breath, his mind racing. He could feel his heart beating wildly in his chest, the adrenaline flooding his body as he weighed his next move. The officers were closing in, the tension between them palpable. He had to make a choice: back down, retreat into the shadows, or stand his ground and face the consequences. But as he looked around the room, his eyes locking with the executives who had once seemed like his allies, Zaid realized that he couldn't back down. Not now. Not when it felt like everything was on the line. He had worked too hard, fought too long to let a room full of people like this define his worth. "They want to break me," he thought bitterly, "but I won't let them." He took a step forward, his jaw set, his eyes flashing with determination. "I'm not leaving, not for you, not for anyone." The room was eerily silent, save for the steady sound of Zaid's breathing. The officers exchanged a look, and in that moment, Zaid could almost hear the unspoken decision made between them. Officer Harris's hand twitched near his holster, and Zaid instinctively took a step back, his heart racing even faster. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, so sharp, so sudden, that it reverberated through the room like a gunshot. Zaid's breath caught in his throat as he looked around, confused. Benjamin's face went pale, his eyes wide with shock. The officers moved quickly, one of them grabbing Zaid's arm and yanking him roughly toward the door. The force of it knocked Zaid off balance, but he steadied himself, his feet digging into the floor, his fists clenching in resistance. "I said, I'm not going anywhere." Zaid's voice cracked with emotion as he struggled against their grip, his body tense and unwilling to yield. Benjamin shot to his feet, his face twisted in frustration. "This is over, Zaid," he spat. "You're done. Leave now, or we'll make it worse for you." The room was swirling with confusion and chaos. Zaid could hear murmurs. Some of the executives were standing, others were just watching, unsure what to do. But it didn't matter. The decision was already made, and he was no longer in control. The officer's hands were firm, unyielding, as they dragged him toward the door. His mind raced with thoughts of retaliation, of fighting back, but something deeper held him in check. What good would it do to escalate it further? What good would it do to prove them right? As the officers escorted him from the room, Zaid's vision blurred. His chest tightened with humiliation, anger, and betrayal. This wasn't just about a meeting. This wasn't just about business. This was something deeper, something that went beyond the walls of the conference room, beyond his position as CEO. This was about who he was, about how the world saw him, and how no matter what he achieved, he would always be fighting against a system that would never fully accept him. The door slammed shut behind him, and Zaid was left standing in the cold hallway, alone, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The world felt like it was crumbling around him, but deep inside something else burned. A fire, a resolve that would never be extinguished. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Zaid stood in the cold, sterile hallway, his breath clouding in the air, each exhale a silent scream. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and anger, struggling to make sense of everything that had just unfolded. His body felt heavy, as if the weight of the entire world had been placed squarely on his shoulders. He could still hear the muffled voices from the conference room, the officers' firm commands, the hiss of Benjamin's venomous words. The adrenaline was starting to ebb, but the sting of humiliation remained sharp, settling into his bones. He hadn't expected this, not in his worst nightmares. He leaned against the cold wall, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to collect his thoughts, to regain some semblance of control. What just happened? He thought. How did I let it get this far? His mind kept racing back to the moment the officers had moved in on him, how everything had spiraled so quickly, the helplessness he had felt as they dragged him from the room like a criminal. He wasn't supposed to be treated like this. He wasn't supposed to feel like this. He had worked so hard to get to this point, so why was it still never enough? The anger boiled over again, and his fists clenched at his sides. They think they can break me. But Zaid refused to let it happen. The world might want him to bend, to apologize, to retreat, but he wouldn't. He couldn't. Not when everything he had worked for, the long nights, the countless sacrifices, was being stripped away in front of his very eyes. He pushed off from the wall, standing up straighter, forcing himself to focus. He needed to keep his head clear. He needed to think. What now? The question hung in the air, unanswered and growing more urgent with every passing second. Footsteps echoed down the hall, and Zaid turned to see a group of his colleagues approaching. They were mostly mid-level managers, faces filled with concern, their eyes darting between him and the closed boardroom door. As they drew closer, one of them, a woman named Carla, spoke up in a hushed voice. "Zaid, are you okay?" Her voice was soft, but Zaid could hear the uncertainty in it, the way she was unsure of how to approach him. Her eyes flicked to the door, then back to him. "What's going on in there?" He stared at her for a moment, trying to gather himself. "I'm fine," he lied, forcing a weak smile. His mind was still spinning, still trying to piece together everything that had just happened. He didn't want to explain it to her, not yet. He didn't know how to. There were no words that could adequately capture the anger and disappointment he felt in this moment. Before he could say anything more, the sound of more footsteps broke the silence. This time it was louder, heavier. Zaid's heart dropped as he turned to see a second group of people. They were officers, security, people who looked like they had been summoned by the higher-ups to make sure nothing else went wrong. The lead officer, a tall man with a square jaw and a stern expression, stepped forward. His eyes scanned Zaid's face, sizing him up as if he were a suspect in some crime. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice hard, "we need to speak with you." Zaid felt his pulse quicken. So this is it, he thought bitterly. The official response, the backup, the system coming down hard. "You've made quite the scene today," the officer continued, his tone dripping with judgment. "We're just here to ensure you leave the building. No further disruptions." Zaid felt a wave of frustration flood over him. Leave the building? It felt like he was being thrown out, discarded like a failure. This wasn't just about a meeting. It was about the system putting him in his place. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand answers. But before he could say anything, the officer held up a hand. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the officer warned. Come with us. Now. Zaid's thoughts churned, but he remained silent. There was no point in arguing. The decision had already been made, and he was already the target. With a grimace, he turned to Carla and the others, who watched him with pity. He couldn't stand the look in their eyes. They weren't there for him. Not really. He had no allies here, no one willing to stand by him when it counted. Without a word, he began walking towards the exit, the officers flanking him on either side. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the weight of the world was dragging him down. As they reached the lobby, Zaid's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing a message from his sister, Maya. "Are you okay? I heard what happened. I'm so sorry." The message hit him like a punch to the gut. His sister had always been his biggest supporter, always believed in him when no one else did. But now even she could only offer words of sympathy, nothing more. Zaid's grip on the phone tightened, and he shoved it back into his pocket, pushing the pain deep down. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not now. Not when he was being thrown out like this. When they reached the front doors of the building, Zaid hesitated for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the skyline of the city. The world outside seemed unchanged, indifferent to the chaos he had just experienced. The cars honked as they passed by, people walking by without a care in the world. He felt so small in that moment, like a speck in the grand scheme of things. The officer standing next to him placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him forward. "Mr. Carter, you need to leave." Zaid didn't resist. He couldn't. He took one last look at the building that had been his battlefield, the place where he had fought to carve out a space for himself in a world that never quite accepted him. He knew deep down that this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The fight was only just beginning. But for now, as he stepped into the cold air, all he could do was take a breath and step away from the life he had once thought he had secured. Zaid walked through the streets, his mind a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. The sharp sting of injustice still lingered, settling deep in his chest. The echo of the officer's commanding voice, the sneer in Benjamin's eyes, it all haunted him. Why me? The question played over and over in his mind, but now he wasn't searching for answers. He was searching for action. He could feel the fire inside him, the flickering embers of a determination that had only grown since his humiliating exit. He wouldn't let this go. This was far from over. At home, Zaid sat at his kitchen table, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at his phone. The message from Maya was still sitting there, a stark reminder of everything that had unfolded. He had heard from a few colleagues, some offering support, others avoiding the confrontation entirely. But it didn't matter. What mattered now was how he would fight back. Zaid was done being passive. He was done accepting the status quo. What had happened to him wasn't an isolated incident, and he wasn't the first one to be wronged, but he could be the last. He made a few calls, the voices on the other end offering some hollow words of encouragement. "We're with you," they all said. But Zaid knew words weren't enough. He needed action. He needed to be heard. This wasn't just about his personal humiliation. It was about a systemic issue that had plagued him and countless others for far too long. He reached out to legal experts, activists, anyone who would listen, determined to turn his pain into something larger, something that could make a difference. Within a few hours, Zaid was sitting in the office of a civil rights lawyer, a woman named Olivia, who had built her career on fighting for those who had been wronged by the system. She listened intently as Zaid recounted the events of the day, the entire humiliation unfolding in vivid detail. His voice cracked once or twice as he recalled the most painful moments, but Olivia's calm demeanor kept him grounded. "We're going to fight this," Olivia said, her tone steady but fierce. "What happened to you is a direct violation of your rights, and we're not going to let it slide. We're going to make sure they are held accountable." Zaid nodded, his resolve strengthening. Olivia's words, her confidence, were a balm for the festering wound inside him. He knew the fight ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time since the incident, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this could be the spark that ignited the change he so desperately wanted to see. The news about the altercation in the boardroom soon made its way through the company and beyond. The incident sparked discussions within law enforcement as the officers involved were put under scrutiny. Meetings were held in the coming days, some of them tense and charged with emotions, others filled with legal jargon and calls for accountability. The higher-ups at the company, some of whom had remained silent in the face of Zaid's injustice, were now forced to confront the problem head-on. They knew that the situation had escalated beyond just one man's humiliation. It had exposed a deeper issue within the system that could no longer be ignored. Officers involved in the altercation were placed on administrative leave as investigations into the incident began. Zaid's lawyers had already gathered a solid case, and the media quickly latched on to the story. Headlines flooded the news: Black executive humiliated by law enforcement, systemic injustice unveiled in high-profile incident. Social media exploded with outrage, with many people rallying behind Zaid, demanding accountability. But as the world seemed to wake up to the issue, Zaid found himself still grappling with his personal turmoil. Late one night, after an exhausting day of meetings and interviews, Zaid found himself alone in his apartment, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. The weight of everything was starting to set in: the overwhelming pressure of the public eye, the legal battle ahead, and the emotional toll it had taken on him. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to center himself. "I can't let this consume me," he thought. "I can't let them break me." A sharp knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and he opened it to find Maya standing there, her face etched with concern. Without a word, she walked in and wrapped him in a tight embrace. The moment was quiet, but Zaid could feel the unspoken support radiating from her. She didn't have all the answers. No one did. But in that moment, Zaid understood something. He wasn't alone. There were people who cared about him, people who were fighting for the same things. He had a voice, and together, they would make sure it was heard. In the following days, as the legal process began to unfold and the public outcry continued, Zaid remained steadfast. The situation had given him a purpose, more than just a desire for justice, but a deep need to ensure that no one else would have to face the same humiliation, the same trauma. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for all the people who had suffered in silence, for those who didn't have the platform to speak out. And though the battle was far from over, Zaid knew one thing for certain: he would keep going, no matter how hard it got. This was just the beginning. The system had failed him, but now he had the chance to change it. As the days turned into weeks, Zaid's fight grew more intense, evolving from a personal quest for justice into a collective battle for the future. The outpouring of support from across the nation gave him strength he didn't know he had. From the streets to social media platforms, people shared their own stories of discrimination and injustice, creating a ripple effect that could no longer be ignored. His name had become synonymous with resilience, with the very embodiment of someone who had been pushed to the limit, but refused to stay down. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a movement, a turning point in the ongoing struggle for racial equality. Every protest, every rally, every conversation that took place, Zaid could feel the weight of it all. But there were moments when the pressure threatened to crush him. The constant scrutiny from the media, the deep personal pain of reliving the humiliation over and over, it all weighed heavily on his shoulders. Yet amid the turmoil, there was a new clarity. Zaid realized that his journey wasn't just about winning a case or getting justice for himself. It was about sparking change for the generations that came after him. This wasn't just about his pain. It was about breaking the cycle of systemic racism, about ensuring that no other person of color would face the kind of discrimination he had endured. The courtroom battles were just one part of the fight. The real challenge was changing the hearts and minds of those who held the power to make the world a better place. Zaid's determination only grew stronger as the case moved forward. The legal process was grueling. Hours upon hours were spent preparing evidence, gathering testimonies, and watching as the opposing lawyers tried to twist the facts to suit their narrative. Zaid's heart raced in the courtroom each day, but it wasn't fear that gripped him. It was a fire that burned within him, a desire to see justice done not just for himself, but for every person who had suffered in silence. He realized that the stakes were far higher than he had initially understood. His actions could change the trajectory of his company, the way law enforcement interacted with people of color, and how future generations would view justice and equality. But as the trial continued, Zaid's fight didn't happen in isolation. A wave of solidarity swept across the country. Protests erupted in multiple cities, each chant echoing Zaid's name. On social media, hashtags like Number Justice for Zaid and Number End Racial Injustice trended, amplifying his cause and spreading it. Far beyond his immediate circle, activists took to the streets, holding signs that read, "No justice, no peace," and "We are all Zaid." The movement had grown larger than one man. It was now a collective effort to confront and dismantle the racial structures that had so long governed the systems of power. Behind the scenes, Zaid worked tirelessly with his lawyer, Olivia, and his allies to ensure that the case was solid. Olivia was relentless, working late into the night, going over every detail of the case with meticulous precision. Zaid marveled at her ability to maintain calm in the face of such an enormous challenge. Every time they gathered to strategize, Zaid's resolve deepened. He knew the system was rigged against them, but he also knew that they were in the right. With each piece of evidence they uncovered, with each conversation they had, they were getting closer to holding those responsible accountable. The courtroom was charged with tension when the trial finally began. Zaid sat in the front, his heart pounding, as the defense attorneys tried to discredit him, painting him as a troublemaker, someone who was simply looking for a payout. It was a strategy designed to humiliate him once more, to paint his dignity as something expendable. But Zaid refused to back down. Every time the defense attempted to discredit him, he stood firm. The audience in the courtroom could feel his unwavering strength, the weight of his conviction. He wasn't just fighting for justice for himself, but for the countless others who had never had the chance to speak out. Then came the day when the tide began to turn. The prosecution presented a damning piece of evidence. Video footage from the security cameras at the office building, showing the officers' aggressive behavior and their discriminatory actions toward Zaid. The room fell silent as the footage played, and for the first time, Zaid saw the truth of what had happened to him, laid bare for everyone to see. The officers' actions could no longer be denied. The public began to shift. What had started as Zaid's personal battle against injustice became a national reckoning. The once dismissed accusations were now undeniable, and the case became the center of a broader conversation about police brutality, racial profiling, and systemic discrimination. Despite the mounting pressure, Zaid felt a sense of calm wash over him as he left the courtroom after the final day of the trial. The fight wasn't over, but he had done everything in his power to ensure that the truth had been heard. No matter the outcome, he had shown up for the cause. He had stood tall in the face of adversity, and that, in itself, was a victory. But the real work was just beginning. In the months that followed, the effects of the trial rippled out in ways Zaid hadn't expected. The officers who had been involved in the incident were not only facing criminal charges, but also had their actions scrutinized by the public. The company where Zaid had once worked began to implement changes, instituting diversity and inclusion programs and committing to an internal investigation to address systemic issues within the corporate structure. Zaid had become a catalyst for change, and the echoes of his fight reverberated in every corner of the country. Zaid's message was clear. This fight was far from over. The court had delivered a verdict, but the battle for equality and justice was a continuous one. He knew that progress wouldn't come overnight, but he also knew that the momentum for change had been set in motion. The power of unity, the strength of collective voices, had proven to be an unstoppable force. And so, with unwavering resolve, Zaid stepped forward into the future, a man changed but more determined than ever. The fight for justice, the battle against systemic racism, was not one that could be won by a single person. But with a movement behind him, with the voices of those who believed in equality, Zaid knew that change was possible. It would take time, and there would be many more struggles ahead, but he was ready to face them. For as long as the fight for justice continued, Zaid would be there, fighting for equality, fighting for the dignity of every person, fighting for a world where no one would ever have to face the kind of discrimination he had. The fight was far from over, but Zaid had no intention of stopping until justice was finally achieved.